It's a topic that was raised from the very first panel on today, and that is a challenge for you within political marketing, but also more generally within programmatic marketing, and that is mapping the creative against our ability to target, simply because you're able to parse an audience down to such a granular level. Not only does it not mean you should do it, but also once you get them, do you really have something of substance to say to them? It's a challenge that is rife throughout programmatic right now. Understanding what's the real ROI on breaking down creative messaging to match that level of targeting is an open question. To take up the question of what we're calling the creative gap, we have an old friend of MediaPost and someone who's been with us at every one of our political marketing shows, Dan Hodges. Dan is the CEO and founder of Consumers in Motion Group, a consulting firm that works with brands throughout the supply chain on their strategies and marketing. Also, I know Dan from many years ago when he was at nPocket for a number of years, one of the first, actually was the first mobile marketing network, then purchased by Nokia, where he spent a number of years at Nokia. Dan Hodges.
Well, thank you. This is a very exciting panel for me. I haven't seen one of these yet, so looking forward. And we really have like the A-team here. The question really is, well-targeted messages are the sort of weak link, and that's the premise of the question and the panel today. And I'm going to introduce the panelists. To my left, there's Martha from 2seventy Strategies. Next to her, John from Kraft, Eric, and then Patrick Ruffini. So, Martha, why don't you start out with just a quick, what you've done and all that stuff.
Sure. Hey guys, I'm Martha Patzer. I'm with 2seventy Strategies, based out of Chicago. Actually, I used to live here in DC for a while, and I got started in politics and marketing, working at the League of Women Voters of the U.S. As kind of an online communications manager, and then I moved over to the DNC in 2010. Worked on the email team, and then we all got catapulted into the 2012 campaign, where I was deputy email director and actually worked with Caitlin Mitchell on the email team. Now I work at 2seventy Strategies, which is a firm that came out of the leadership of the 2012 campaign, and we tried to apply the lessons that we learned in 2012 to nonprofits and corporations and mission-driven organizations.
I'm John Randall. I got my start in politics back in 2005, originally of old media and radio and TV. Moved over to the NRSC in 2008, where I started to dip my toe into digital and how far it's kind of come. I was the online communications manager, so you needed a different communications team just to talk to online folks. After the 2008 cycle, excuse me, I went over to launch the digital division at the NRCC, where worked over there in the 2010, and a part of the 2012 cycle, left there to go to be the director of political advertising at AOL, working with right-leaning campaigns and candidates and causes during the 12 cycle, and then after that came over to Kraft, the vice president of digital, where we're managing development and advertising as well.
All right. I'm Eric Reif. I'm the email director at the Democratic National Committee. I came to the DNC at the beginning of the last election cycle from Weber Shandwick, Powell Tate, where I worked on digital for some of their government public affairs work and health insurance work. And before that, I was in Chicago with Martha and Caitlin as the senior digital advertising manager on the Obama campaign's online advertising team.
I'm Patrick Ruffini. I founded the digital agency Engage after working, leading kind of the digital team at the Republican National Committee, and got my start in digital politics in 2002 at the RNC, and later transitioning to the E-campaign team on the Bush-Cheney re-election campaign. Those were the days. And a couple years ago, started to tackle some of these problems more from the data analytics side of the equation with Echelon Insights, a new firm.
Great. So in 13 days, we'll know who won the Iowa primary. In 20 days, we'll know who won the New Hampshire primary. So Tim from Bully Pulpit earlier said, and I just have his notes, he said that Tim talked about media planning and having a seat at the table with creative. And I guess my first question to the panel is, does the does the creative team have a place at the table?
I can start. I think it depends on what campaign you're talking to. I think the most effective digital operations will have a seat at the table, and that's probably not controversial here. I do think that that's changed a lot over the last 10 years, maybe starting with Howard Dean, and then definitely with Obama in 2008, where we realized that digital, in order to be effective and raise money and do the whole grassroots fundraising thing, we really had to be separate from a finance operation, or even separate from communications, a communications department. So I would advocate that it depends kind of on how big your staff is and how many resources you have, and the level of the seniority maybe of your talent. But generally speaking, I think most effective campaigns really will have digital and creative as equal to other leadership positions on a campaign.
No, I mean, I absolutely agree. I was going to say they should. I mean, the beauty of digital specifically is understanding what works and what doesn't very quickly. It's not the same as sending out a TV ad, running a poll, and then hoping it works. Not to badmouth TV, but absolutely, we try to make sure that our creatives are part of the process. A, so they understand what's going on, but B, they can see what's working and what's not, and understand that for future iterations of what we're working on.
Yeah, I think to echo a point Martha was making, having an equal seat at the table, I think is really important. And I think that's one of the things that's changed from the digital folks and the creative folks being able to be in the room, which is great. But I think now getting to the point where the digital and creative folks are starting to actually make and influence more of those decisions at a higher level has become really important.
I think right now they're not really talking to one another, or creative optimization means very different things to a digital person than it would for, let's say, a pollster, or let's say somebody who is doing kind of the core message development work of the campaign. When we're talking about kind of what works online, it's often, we're talking about email. Like, largely speaking, the biggest gains from it have been email programs. And, is there a red button or is there a green button? And these are very different questions than you might see a campaign strategist and people who are doing the creative for TV tackling. And so I'd love to see more of because I do think digital has quite a bit to contribute in terms of understanding which messages are moving online. And it's obviously great if you can have a focus group that tells you which messages are the top 3 messages of the campaign. But I want to know what people are clicking on, what's happening in real time. And so I think that there needs to be, yes, an equal seat at the table, but just a constant sort of back and forth of information between the silos in a campaign. I think the silos are absolutely deadly to actually have an integrated messaging operation that lives across digital, TV, whatever medium you're trying to communicate with.
So how do you, it's for the general team here, but for Patrick or anyone could take this, but how do you, that's a trick, because people, attention spans have gone from 12 to 8 seconds. Mobile phone is maybe 5 words on a banner or an image. Social's got other characteristics. TV has, TV's TV. So how do you modulate? And it's such a rapid cycle. Trump will say something, Bernie says something, and things are just changing dynamically. And so people's temperature, passion is going up and down all day. So how do you optimize this across, impactful screen? I think Tim had said earlier that mobile is 32%, and now it's like almost 70%, and Latinos is 80%. So how do you handle all this? Because it's very different.
So brevity has sort of become sort of the coin of the realm, and I don't think that when you are focus grouping or you're doing traditional message work that we have yet sort of, how do you actually test a 6-second looping Vine video? I mean, that's got, what's the common currency? A message needs to get across in a very short amount of time, and the actual, it's not just attention spans getting lower, the actual formats are restrictive, or a Facebook video, which doesn't really, you can't count on having audio for it. And it's those kinds of those are I think the biggest pitfalls. More than I will be talking about an issue that you won't be talking. You know, it's sort of like one side is talking about a different issue than another side. It's I've created a 30-second TV ad which is completely inappropriate for Facebook, the Facebook newsfeed, because there's there's no way for people to get the information in it without turning on the sound.
Well, you need to continually adapt, just as with Facebook and kind of the mobile first becoming the way that most people are consuming their information. I think you're now starting to see other mediums such as video have to adjust and adapt. As Patrick said, with not having any audio automatically playing, you need to be able to convey that message not only without any sound, but also in 3 to 4 seconds. At least get that person to pause in their news feed and at least look at it for a few seconds, understand what's going on, and entice them to want to learn more. So you're seeing an adaptation. You saw it first with display ads, and now you're seeing it, emails also gone mobile. Now you're starting to see video having to change, in a sense, kind of how it's fundamentally created for a mobile first environment.
And that's a major resource investment too. I think that's one of the big things that has started to change and needs to keep changing, because you can no longer have, the one set of TV folks, not to keep harshing on the TV folks, but the one set of TV folks who are producing, to Patrick's point, the one spot, the 2 spots, the 3 spots. You have to have a lot of creative investment on the digital level to make sure that what you're doing, you're actually producing enough content that you can use it across all of the channels that you need to.
I also think it really can't be overstated, the importance of a message frame. So when we talk about targeting, and I think the whole premise of this panel is around this notion of a creative gap. It's essential to have a single message frame that you can go back to as a candidate or a campaign, and that's something that President Obama had in 2012, that I think in some past cycles, not to knock anyone who worked on John Kerry's campaign, but I think in 2012 we had a little bit stronger of a message frame, a core message frame, that each department, so digital, comms, press, depending on what the audience was, could take and adapt. But the interesting thing about that message frame in 2012 is that an organizer in Florida had memorized that spiel, and Eric probably can say parts of it now. And so had we in Chicago headquarters. So everyone on the campaign had the same message frame that we were working from, whether it was at the doors or online.
And across all of our digital platforms too. We were talking about this a little bit earlier, but continuing to hit that same message over and over and over again, so that no matter where you looked online, what device you were looking at, who you were speaking to, whether it was somebody who was there in person, everybody's getting that sort of same consistency.
Yeah, and I think that this is a point that can't be stated enough, because I think sometimes these discussions tend to in some degree, we say we have 50 different segments on the voter file. Why don't we have 50 different messages? And I think well, wait a second, let's step back. Do you actually want that? Is that what we really want? And it's not to say that targeted messaging isn't appropriate in certain instances, but I think people are making it out to be sort of a panacea. And campaign needs to do what's optimal, not necessarily just targeting for targeting's sake. And if the 50 different messages actually works better than the unifying message, great. I'm not sure that's actually going to be the case, though.
So in the 2012 campaign, President Obama he used mobile for, say, June 2012. It was for Romney is not a good business guy. Romney comes in, next thing you know, everyone's out of work. And that was for June of 2012. In July of 2012, it was Romney was the worst governor, and then basically there's some micro-targeting in August, and it was very effective. So are there any cases where you can say that was a good case study, or you should use, this is a really great use case to reach Latinos. We're gonna fire up the mobile phones and reach them. Are there any guidelines where either by message or by demographic group where someone might say, well, you know what, that's a social lane, forget about mobile, or they say, no, this is a great use case for mobile, let's blast. So how do you, because that's, there's the tactic, there's the consumption, there's the message, there's the moment. So how does it all how does that work?
Sure. I think in 2012, that was primarily an audience question. And I think whether you use mobile, whether you use social, I think now for mobile in particular, mobile phone adoption and use as either a second screen or primary screen has become so ubiquitous that you can, and our ability to kind of do the level of drilled down, individualized voter file targeting, whatever it may be, on mobile phones the same way that we were doing it on desktop devices 4 or 5 years ago, has gotten to the point where you can now kind of do the same thing across devices to the same audiences. As far as case studies, I think those are both good examples of kind of the integration and coordination we started talking about earlier. I mean, those are messages that, you were saying earlier, you kept seeing it on your phone. That's definitely true. If you were in the right area of the country or the right type of person, you were also seeing it on TV. You were also getting it when you were looking at local news about the election. And I think that's where that kind of close relationship between the online media, the television, other kind of paid media people really came into play.
And the overall message about Romney, I would say, didn't actually change that much throughout the course of the campaign. Of course, we had different opposition research that we had access to at different points in the campaign, and everyone remembers 47% and that whole thing. But it all went back to an opposition to our message frame about the middle class, and Romney, we were trying to show that he was outside of that, like somehow, corporate buyout specialist with offshore tax accounts. So even though that might have changed in terms of the content that we were using, it was all about that frame of Romney being different than you, different than the middle class.
Great. So I'm going to give you a challenge to solve. So you're all working on the Bernie Trump campaign. You've just been elected, and you're here. You're in the room here, and we're trying to figure this out. And a new piece of data came by that said that Latinos, basically, if you can reach Latinos in Iowa, which are about 5% of the population, it could actually swing. We know that Romney won, Santorum won by 32 votes in the last, so it's a very marginal type election. We also know Latinos typically don't vote. I think someone was talking about millennials, similar characteristics. So you've got 13 days, Iowa will be history in 14 days. So how do you approach this problem from the targeting and the messaging point of view?
I think both. It's interesting because I think the two candidates that you're talking about have succeeded by doing very much the opposite of what we're talking about here in terms of Make America Great Again is a very simple message. And I think, the things Bernie Sanders is putting out there too are also very simple messages, and in fact, that are very easy to understand and grasp. And there's not a whole lot of, we're going to say one thing to Latinos and another thing to another group, because frankly, it's all going to be on YouTube. It's all going to be, in the minute you start, the minute you're Ted Cruz and you say one thing to a New York fundraiser audience and it leaks, and then all of a sudden you've got and then you're talking about New York values from the debate stage. So I do think that this is challenging, I think, to people I think as much as I may not have my own opinions about what's happening in the Republican primary, but it definitely challenges us as marketers, and it challenges really to up our game, because I think that they are doing a really good job, not necessarily with a very targeted, micro, segmented approach to messaging, but it is a very simple, authentic, easy to understand message that each of them is putting out there and seems to be pretty successfully doing.
Great. So we also know that the persuasion phase is very important, and in the primaries, people make up their minds right as they're going into the booth. So how would you message, or how would you use targeted messaging to kind of change their minds?
Well, I mean, you've got to understand what is going to change their minds, and that's going to take some time to get there. I mean, you're not just going to say, okay, we're going to start running digital and mobile ads, and there's going to be a really, picture of a happy couple go to the voting booth or whatever, and that's going to change minds. You need to understand this. I mean, that's why it's really important that this isn't something you just decide to do 13 days before you need a result. That this is something that you need to work on. You need to understand. You need to take online and offline activities, merge them together, and understand what's going on. See what people are engaging with. Seeing what targeting is working with which ad, which is working with which landing page. Testing everything from the very beginning, so that by the time you get to 13 days out, you're understanding what's working, what's motivating your audience, and you're able to do more of that, not only on digital, but you're also able to employ that with door knockers, to be able to employ that with messaging and communications, to be able to do that with messaging and fundraising. I mean, it's all working together, going back to not having these be siloed, that they all need to be talking to each other, because you're able to measure all of these results. So why not put those results to good use to make the campaign better overall?
Yeah, and campaigns have to your point, make decisions all the time about where to spend their resources. And I would say if you're getting yourself together 13 days out, which is obviously not ideal, in that case maybe it would be more worth spending the investment on some more traditional phones or door-to-door, where you can kind of get that real-time feedback in terms of how is that messaging persuading people or moving them.
So if your clients came to you and asked you for a point of view on targeting and messaging, and the right media mix and the right use of analytics, what would you say to them?
I think there needs to be, I mean, just in terms of on the audience side, there needs to be a lot more intelligence around how do we make sure that our message is seen enough times by every conceivable possible demographic. I mean, I think right now, I mean, even in the discussions around TV versus digital are not terribly informative, because we have metrics like GRP on the TV side, which give, I think, in some cases, a very false sense of certainty around that we have reached the entire population of voters, when we know that's not true, that there are 30 to 40% of voters who are either not watching TV or very infrequent TV watchers or cord cutters or highly unlikely to have seen an ad, but they're in other places. So I think that just in terms of thinking, particularly as we're getting what some of the TV stations, particularly in Iowa and New Hampshire, are doing to their rates. It's not necessarily you're going to raise a lot more money, and it's not going to buy you more ads. It's just going to really pay for higher rates on TV stations, and so really being smart about where can I most cost effectively communicate, so that I can get first, second, third impressions on the broadest possible segment of my voters that I can target, and rather than just carpet bombing the same people 50 times over and over again.
Yeah, I mean, it's important that, excuse me, it's important that everything works together. I mean, I don't think that you're going to find a single digital person who doesn't think that there should be some sort of TV in the mix. There shouldn't be other forms of communication in the mix. It's finding that right mix of what's going to work, what's going to get, what is the sweet spot of frequency that you need to reach that voter to understand. Is it 7, is it 5, to get them to either make a donation, to change their opinion, or to get them to vote. I mean, the 3 important things in a campaign. And so, again, that goes back to why this is something that needs to start early, why the digital, why the creative, why the communicators all need to be in the same room together talking about it and having an equal voice, so that you can test a lot of things, understand what works, and continue to evolve the campaign.
Yeah, and I would say when it comes to targeting, it really is about balance and testing your assumptions, something that Patrick said earlier. You don't want to just assume that 50 different messages is the right way to go. If you have an assumption, test it, see if it's worth the investment. Because what we saw in 2012 is similar to what Caitlin showed up here with Emily's list, where demographic testing or messaging might make logical sense, but when we actually tested it, it wasn't worth the ROI there. So I think that's important to keep in mind.
And there are also messages, to the point Patrick was making about Bernie, Trump. They all have a relatively simple message. The things that I think sometimes we can work ourselves into a trap as digital people of saying like, oh, we've got all this data, we can do all this testing, and a lot of times, there is actually one message that is going to resonate to all people at all times, and you really have to reinforce one message which may have 1 or 2 or 3 points. We were talking about some of the Romney messaging. It all, as Martha said, ties back to here is the difference, and here are the 3 primary differences. Finding that spot that can work to a broader audience in a lot of cases will end up being more effective.
And just one point in favor of targeting, though, because I think we're all talking about how it can be overly complicated here, and you can end up shooting yourself in the foot with good intentions. But what we did see in 2012 was how powerful sophisticated testing can be on the digital side when you know who you're talking to, and that was absolutely essential for us that election cycle because of the change in financing for campaigns and the outside spending that we were dealing with. We actually had to make up a significant gap, and that gap of what we raised in 2012 and what we raised in 2008 was largely due to rigorous testing that we did. Caitlin made this point earlier, but we found that past online behavior was really a better indicator for predicting future behavior than anything else, including where you live or what you look like or how old you are.
And the other thing, I think that digital is such a great proving ground such a great testing vehicle, and it should be used to, I think, inform the decisions of what gets actually put on TV. Very often, what we're seeing in campaigns we deal with is that, people want to do the message testing work up front. It's sort of this big bang delivery, but really there's a continuous feedback loop that's happening every day on digital in terms of voters are actually telling us what actually matters to them. Voters are actually clicking on ads with different issue characteristics, and we can learn from that. But I see very few campaigns actually doing that very well right now, and the issue set can change. And I think that the idea is not to, my message would not be, don't make, it's not, you shouldn't make the 50 different creative pieces. It's just the way we do it the way it's done in digital is you maybe start with 50 and you narrow it down to 1, 2, or 3 that really work. Rather than the goal is not to end up with lots of different creative messages. And I think that's the culture shift that needs to happen kind of in campaigns, because the lift that's possible from better creative is much higher than the lift that's possible from better targeting. And so if campaigns invested a little bit more in content creation, invested a little bit more in testing, and maybe a little bit less in placement, sorry for anyone who's selling, raw media placement, then I think that the potential is there for, an even better outcome for people.
That's totally true, especially when it comes to the sample size that you have, right? Like if you have 20 million people on your email list, you can test and target and be more effective that way. But if you don't have 20 million people, and most people don't, then better creative actually is the way to go and spend your resources. I would say totally agree with that.
And starting in advance as well, I would say, like when you get down to that smaller sample size, we have to recognize that you're not going to be able to decide 2 weeks out from Iowa, well, how do we start testing then? You've really got to make that investment up front. And I think that's when having that be part of the decision-making process becomes really important.
John, you talked about iterative testing, which is absolutely great. So how do we find a relevant message? How do we figure out what message is relevant on what screen? Because I think that's, the premise is there's a lot of targeting, you can do geocoding, you can do time of day, day of week, you can do blah, blah, blah. But how do you actually figure out what is that relevant message? Because I think that's the core of it. I've been in the mobile space for a decade now, and I've seen around the world that relevant message, that works. And it can be just 3 words. So how do we get there? Because I think that's the premise of the panel. It's like, how do you get there?
Well, I think the first thing you have to do, and this is amazingly sometimes the hardest thing for clients and campaigns to do, is to first say, what do we want this person to do? What does success look like? Is it a donation? Is it just getting someone to an educational website and getting them to stay on that site for a certain amount of time? So first you need to actually identify what you want them to do. And then, again, it is really important that you start you almost approach it as an experiment in which you have a hypothesis and you test that hypothesis against one or two things. The important thing too with a lot of this, and I couldn't agree more, that creative is incredibly important, especially in an age when you're dealing with so many different distractions that you need to get someone to stop and look at it. That you should only be doing the amount of testing that you can actually take that data, understand that data, and make that data actionable. Just because if you run 50 different pieces of creative, if you have that capability, that's great. But for most of our clients, we say, hey, let's start with 2 or 3 or 4. Let's figure that out, and let's go from there, and let's iterate and keep going. I think that's the easiest way to kind of understand what that message is. I mean, as we talked about, the biggest failure that I see often in digital is not learning from what doesn't work, because every single that you run, every single campaign that you run is, for lack of a better word, a rolling poll. Understanding, again, what the electorate or what your audience is engaging with and what they're not engaging with, and you can then make decisions based on that.
And another big pitfall, and we talk about test, which obviously is absolutely what you need to do, but just that everyone has a different interpretation of what the test results actually showed. So just there was this big study out a couple weeks ago that showed that yard signs apparently work, and they lift 1.7% vote share, and the Politico headline about it was literally says yard signs do not work. All right, and it's just like, well, I mean, if you're actually in a campaign, maybe you might want, if you're Al Gore, you might have wanted that 1.7%. Not that I'm not advocating for yard signs would have elected him, but just there's so many times we've been in situations where we'll present a test result to a campaign manager, and the interpretation of it will be almost diametrically opposite of what your interpretation might have been. And frankly, sometimes there is room for differing interpretations on these things. And so I think it's sort of not getting too caught up in, yay, we tested, but nobody could agree on what the test results actually said.
With all this targeting, we talked to everyone about this. How do you work it so that your mobile messaging isn't counterproductive to your TV message? You're micro-targeting and you're actually confusing. But so it can be, on one hand, it can be a very valuable tool, but on the other hand, it could be a mess, because you're confusing people about Bernie Trump. Is he for whales or is he against whales? And so how do you, going back to Tim's comment, the seat at the table, how do you ensure that there is someone's there saying, well, look, we're reaching Latinos with that message, but our over-the-air message is this, and so we're actually insulting them, and so who's in charge of that overall strategy?
I mean, it varies agency to agency, campaign to campaign, but it is really important that everyone understands which direction you're pushing and what your messages are. To talk about what you said, that there was very simple messaging that was, that everybody was on the same page, everyone was saying the same thing. There might be a slight iteration, but the overall message was the same. And I think that's, again, the important nature of getting everyone in the room and having everyone have a seat at the table, so they understand what's going on. They understand the messaging, the story arc that you're going to be telling over the campaign, so that you're not one day saying this on digital and the next day saying this on TV, and then there's a print story in which the candidate's quoted a different way, and then the fundraising mail piece is something completely different. I mean, you always need to be working in conjunction, because again, these are not siloed tactics or tools. These should all be working together. They're all just different tools to execute the same strategy.
Right, and this is really, I think, a question about leadership. In 2012, our campaign manager, and even I would say all the way up to President Obama, was bought into the notion of data-driven messaging and testing. That said, on the email side, let's say we had found that a fundraising message that said something ridiculous about Romney was performing better, or said something ridiculous about Obama that wasn't true, was performing better than another email, we would not send that out, even though it would have maybe helped our fundraising goals, because, as Caitlin said, we started from a place of respecting the list, and we also needed to be coordinated with the other departments on the campaign. So even though we had crazy ambitious fundraising goals, we couldn't sacrifice the message and the overall I guess, respect for the list, and also just general point that we were trying to make for the money that came in at the other end of the email. This came up a little bit in 2014 around the debate around email and how it's used in if people are, using it in a certain way that is going against maybe the overall message of a party or a candidate.
And you also have to be doing that kind of coordination from the start. I mean, I think that's the biggest thing is like when you're bringing on a digital team or a digital consultant, there can be a lot of expectation from, leadership that like, oh, we can do this kind of testing. We're going to do these 20 things that are going to be digital specific. But if you get to that position, but the left hand's not talking to the right, when it comes to other media on other channels, that's where you're going to run into a problem of, the message that you're sending out over social media, over online advertising is going to be sometimes in conflict with what they're seeing on TV.
I mean, I think we see this most prominently in fundraising, because, obviously there's not even you're not just optimizing across a single set of objectives sometimes. It's, one department is responsible for generating fundraising results, and another department is more interested in persuasion. And even just harmonizing those two things can be a challenge. I mean, and I think, in particular, like, when you have the pressure to fundraise, oftentimes it's very difficult to, and, you're saying things that, appeal to base voters but are not necessarily the general election voters you're going to need. So there's so many different ways and variables here that make it that make it challenging to have that holistic coordination across departments.
I think we're getting close to the end here. We're getting close. Are there any questions out in the audience? We've got a great panel here, and we'd love to get any questions you have. Great. So if we're in a mode where we're summarizing, if there are there 3 tips, 3 ways of looking at this, 3 filters? How do you, it's a different world. I mean, 32% mobile penetration in 12, now it's 67, and Latinos is 80, 85, depending on where you are. It's almost like the media plans per state can't be the same, because Miami is going to be different from Ohio and Iowa and so forth. So any sort of best practices, distillation of thoughts, guidelines based on a lot of your experience, do this or look out for that, or maybe it's just iterate, just test everything, see how it all rolls back up.
Okay. Didn't mean to cut you there. No, I would say first off, never stop testing. Don't be afraid of quote unquote failure. I mean, when I was in politics, I had a boss that said the scariest thing that you can say in politics is I don't know, and I think that it's actually one of the best things is to be able to say I don't know, but I'm going to find out. So never stop learning. And the other thing that I would say that I think is very important, and I've actually had this conversation before, is just because you can doesn't mean you should. Just because you can turn on a digital campaign 14 days out from the Iowa caucus doesn't mean you should. So understanding a lot of that, just because you can test certain things doesn't mean that you should. So understanding what data is important, what data is actionable, I think are incredibly important. And if you understand that and you approach it that way, it's very difficult in a sense to quote unquote fail, because even things that don't work will teach you things that can educate you for the next go round.
I would say to test, but also know where your limitations are. And I think someone brought this up earlier, but it's really important to check your testing integrity and make sure that your experiments are actually sound and will project the outcome that you're looking for. I know there are some experiments that people have run around looking back at an email and how it performed and seeing that it might have done differently if we had given it longer to cook, so to speak. So always test and retest your assumptions. And then on campaigns, that this is different from, I think, in corporations or the corporate world, you have a limited amount of time and resources. And so sometimes it's better to not test, get something out the door very quickly, maybe after a debate or a speech, and tap into that emotion than to try to hyper-target everyone and get them a different message that might have to take longer to get out the door.
I think all of that's certainly true. I think also being prepared to make a major investment, fight for a major investment when it comes to people, talent, amount of creative you're going to need to produce. people who are going to be able to interpret those tests, people who are going to be able to present the results of tests in ways that are compelling. Not every campaign, not every organization has the luxury of a large staff, but to the extent that you can make the case for having more people who can do more of those elements, I think the more successful you're going to be.
I think it's wiring the campaign for all, everything that has been said so far, amen, and wiring the campaign so that the results from digital can actually make their way over to the traditional side and are actually relevant and actionable on the traditional side, because the mindset that, we're dealing with on that side is that, there really isn't any real content testing. In terms of a 30-second TV spot, you're not necessarily going to run a test and tell a campaign manager that the $25,000 investment they made in TV production isn't actually going to go anywhere because the ad didn't test. The ad didn't test very well, in our test markets. Maybe in corporate America you can do that, and so really kind of setting the processes up so that digital, the luxury we have of being able to test everything in digital, can actually be used to improve sort of the broadcast and the more traditional messaging that's happening.
Great. And last question for GeoTV. Are there any parts of the media mix that would be substantially different this time in 2016 versus 2014? Because again, the mix is different, getting out the vote. So any thoughts there as to how the consumer shift has changed that part of the campaign?
I think some of the earlier panels were talking about video and the increase in consumption of video, the increase of channels you can have that on. I think that is going to be, we started to see that in 2012. We saw that a little bit more in 2014. But when you have candidates with smaller budgets, it's harder to get kind of the video production budget that you want. I think that's going to be a bigger and bigger part of the end games for these campaigns.
I agree, and I also, working with some even corporate clients, trying to make things seem a little bit more real in the video realm. There's the ability to very powerfully capture images and be able to share those very quickly. As you are now your own content distribution. You're not relying on the press. You're not relying on a third party. So being able to take video that you get behind the scenes, take video of the campaign or the candidate doing something that's kind of fits within the narrative potentially, or maybe doesn't, but is what you want to get out, and being able to very quickly get that online and being very quickly able to get that out to your supporters or additional folks, I think is very important. And I hope that the media mix continues to shift, I don't want to say more towards digital, but more towards what actually is going to work. And if that is a TV ad, if that is a mailer, then do it. We're ultimately working on campaigns.
Or a lawn sign. A lawn sign too. Right?
A lawn sign, yeah. if you need to move at 1.7%.
Yeah.
But no, ultimately in a campaign, you're judged by winning, right. And so even the digital folks will say, they're not going to be judged by other. You'll say, hey, we ran a great digital campaign, and that's great, but we didn't win. So I think that it's not saying we needed to shift it more towards mobile, we need to shift it more towards this or that, but I do think it is an emphasis on creative and making sure that, again, your ads and your message is standing out and that it's resonating and that people are understanding it and that it's reaching them and you're getting that saturation.
I think not having a religious devotion to any one medium over any other medium and just understanding what the place is for each medium. The media mix is going to look very different in a 2016 general election with a much broader electorate, with young voters who are voting for the first time, and a significant percentage of those than it will look like for the Iowa caucus. So being able to dynamically adjust the media mix based on, and even people who do primarily TV, I think will tell you this, that I think being seen as honest brokers of information about what different media mixes will work in different situations, I think is very important.
One thing I would say that I think is interesting to look at in 2016 or look forward to is that might be different from past cycles is just the competition for space online, also just in a crowded inbox environment. Once the nominees get out of the primaries, they won't have to compete obviously with other candidates in their own parties. They'll be the nominee, but they will still have to compete with J.Crew and marketers who are constantly catching on more and more to this idea that email is and other media is a powerful thing that if you invest in it, you'll see that return. So I think that's going to be challenging because the answer can't always be send more email or do more. We're going to have to get sophisticated and I think really creative when it comes to the messaging itself, if not also the targeting.
Great discussion. Any questions?
I think it's a wrap. Dan, thank you very much. We're going to, let me bring our next panel up. As I mentioned at the top of the show, one of the places most obviously, and you all already